Before a steam train can move, something incredible has to happen. Deep inside its engine room, fire is lit, coal is shoveled in, and cold water slowly turns into hot, powerful steam. Bit by bit, the train begins to breathe, hissing, rumbling, coming to life like a living creature made of metal and smoke. Welcome to the engine room. It's hot, noisy, and full of hard work. We're going to open the door to the engine room and take you deep inside a steam train like you've never seen it before. Most people only see the outside of a steam train or hear its whistle in the distance. But behind that is a world powered by fire and muscle. In this video, we're going inside into the heart of the train where everything happens. You'll see what it's like for the workers who kept these machines running. You'll hear the sounds, feel the heat, and learn how every lever, gauge, and scoop of coal played a part. It wasn't easy work, but it was important, and it made the steam train one of the most powerful machines of its time. So get ready to step back in time. The world was still dark when the first steps were taken. The sky above the railway yard was painted in layers of deep blue and gray, the kind of quiet dawn that only the earliest risers ever witnessed. Frost clung to the rails. Breath turned to mist. And in the middle of the sleeping yard stood the engine, cold, silent, and immense. It didn't look alive, not yet. Its iron body stood still, soot-streaked and wet with the dew of the night. This was a job that required patience, rhythm, and a kind of quiet respect for the machine. You didn't just light a steam engine, you brought it back to life, step by step, flame by flame. Dry wood, broken into smaller pieces, carefully arranged deep inside the firebox. Then the paper-crumpled sheets, curled and folded like tinder flowers, placed beneath the wood. And finally, a match. The massive driving wheels, once blurs of motion, now rested in perfect stillness, half sunk in shadow. But there was something about it, some presence. Even as it slept, the engine demanded attention, a quiet giant waiting to wake. Then came the fireman. The boiler was massive, a steel drum that could hold thousands of liters of water. Cold water. And cold water did not take kindly to sudden heat. If the fire burned too hot too fast, it could crack the boiler, damage pipes, even cause injury. So the fireman fed the flames slowly. Coal, then pause. Coal, then pause. The windows fogged over. Soot floated in the air, caught in the beams of early light beginning to pour through the glass. The firebox was now a furnace, and the boiler above it began to pulse with heat. A distant clang echoed from the turntable, but the engine was still the center. Everything depended on it being ready. The pressure gauge climbed slowly 10 pounds, 15, 20. Not enough to move the train, not yet, but enough to feel the heartbeat beginning. The levers, once frozen in place, now shifted slightly when touched. The entire space was transforming, coming to life. Steam curled up from the safety valves, thicker now, rising in white plumes that caught the morning sun. The whistle sang again louder, this time clear and strong. The sound bounced off the station walls. A declaration. The engine was awake. Everything was still and hollow, like entering a cathedral long abandoned. The firebox door creaked open with a metallic groan, revealing a blackened chamber that had once held the heart of the engine fire. A hot burst against the cold ground. A twitch of the needle on the pressure gauge. A low hum that seemed to come from deep within the metal skin. The driver checked the reverser, easing it forward. A final glance at the pressure full now. The train was alive. The power of fire, water, and will. The ancient breath of pressure and purpose. The ritual of waking a sleeping giant, one flame at a time. The whistle, still covered in frost, let out a faint, high-pitched groan as if the train itself was yawning from its sleep. Metal shrieked against metal as the wheels turned once, twice. then caught grip. The whole body surged forward in a controlled tremble. A plume of smoke burst from the stack, dark and heavy, curling into the morning sky. The engine, once a corpse of iron, began to stir. Now it was only soot and silence. He walked alone through the fog, boots crunching on gravel, carrying nothing but a bag of tools, a bundle of kindling, and the knowledge of ritual. He said little, just a nod. His eyes scanned the gauges, the firebox, the water level in the sight glass. Satisfied, he began checking the levers, testing the brakes, oiling the moving parts. This was the dance driver and fireman, each with a role, each with years behind their hands. The cab was cold. Metal surfaces bit at bare hands. First, the kindling. With a strike and hiss, the fireman held the flame to the paper. At first, nothing. Then, a slow breath of fire. The paper curled, blackened, and caught. The kindling crackled and shifted, small flames licking upward in gentle rhythm. The fire had to grow steadily. The fireman knelt by the door, watching the glow begin to spread, a flickering orange that danced over the firebox walls. The first real warmth began to push out into the cab, brushing against the cold steel. A newborn fire in the belly of the beast. It wasn't heat yet. It wasn't power, but it was the beginning. More coal was added in careful handfuls, not too much. Outside, the engine remained silent. But inside, something had shifted. It took time. And gradually, the pressure began to rise. The first signs were subtle. A soft hiss. Condensation formed on pipes. Steam valves started to tremble. The fireman wiped his brow. The cab was warming quickly now. He adjusted the dampers, letting more air into the fire. The flames roared louder. The coal glowed red and white. Outside, the yard was beginning to wake. Other workers moved between carriages. The signal box lit up. The driver arrived, stepping into the cab with practiced steps. Together, they prepared the beast. The lubricator hissed. The water injector sang. The wheels shifted. Just a little. A gentle rock, like a sleeper stretching its limbs. Then, again, more definite. The pistons hissed. Steam jetted from release valves below the cab. She was ready. The fireman stoked the fire one last time, spreading the coal across the glowing bed evenly. With a sharp hiss and a pull of the throttle, the engine gave a lurch. The iron beast had awoken, and with each turn of the wheel, with every chug of effort, she moved not just steel but memory. And this was only the beginning. The firebox was the heart of the beast. A small, dark chamber deep inside the engine's iron frame, where raw power was born from flame and fuel. The firemen worked here, tending to a living inferno that transformed cold water and coal into relentless motion. As the morning light crept through the cab's windows, inside the firebox, the world was entirely different. A realm of intense heat, glowing embers, and the sharp hiss of steam. The fireman knelt by the open firebox door, eyes trained on the fiery core, hands steady with long-practiced care. This was no mere task. It was a careful, constant vigil over a delicate balance between destruction and life. The door creaked as it opened, releasing a blast of heat so fierce it felt like the breath of a dragon. Flames roared, bright orange and white, twisting and licking around the glowing coal. The fireman's face was bathed in flickering light, sweat gathering on his brow as he worked. Each shovel of coal he scooped from the tender was measured, precise. Too much coal at once could smother the flames, choking the fire and stalling the engine. Too little, and the fire would wane, unable to generate the intense heat required to build the necessary steam pressure. Feeding the fire was a careful art. Inside the firebox, coal burst into flames, sending sparks that flickered like tiny stars. The heat was so strong it distorted the air, shimmering in waves. The firebox walls glowed a dull red, radiating warmth that filled the cab and made the metal structure hum softly. Outside, water hissed and bubbled inside the boiler as heat transferred through thick steel walls. The pressure gauge needle began its slow climb. The engine was stirring from within. The fireman scraped the grate with a poker, clearing away ash and clinker that could block airflow. The grate was the foundation for the fire, iron bars that allowed hot air to flow beneath the coal bed. Ash buildup choked the fire's breath and had to be removed frequently to keep the flames alive. His movements were practiced and rhythmic. Shovel coal, rake ashes, adjust dampers, pause and watch. The fire was a living thing, and he was its keeper. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with smoke, soot, and the sharp tang of burning coal. Every breath the fireman took was hot and dry. His clothes were coated in grime, his skin slick with sweat. But there was no time to rest. The fire demanded constant attention. The damper controls allowed him to regulate how much air fed the fire. More oxygen meant hotter flames, but quicker coal consumption. Less air slowed the burn, but risked lowering the steam pressure. With a small twist of a lever, the fireman opened the damper wider. The fire responded instantly. Flames surged upward, roaring louder, licking higher. The pressure gauge climbed past 20 pounds, then 30. Steam hissed from safety valves, white clouds puffing into the cool morning air. The fireman fed coal in steady handfuls, spreading it evenly to maintain a glowing bed of embers. The firebox glowed like the heart of a volcano, deep reds and bright oranges pulsing with heat. Sparks flew in occasional bursts, tiny stars dancing before fading. The fireman's hands were steady and sure, his eyes unblinking. Outside, the engine's pistons began to move, rhythmic chuffing filling the air as the iron giant awakened. The fireman knew the fire was both magnificent and dangerous. Too fierce, and the boiler might rupture, or valves could fail. Too weak, and the engine would stall. Unable to move the heavy load ahead, a delicate balance had to be maintained. Every moment, every shovel of coal. The fire flared unpredictably at times, sending tongues of flame into the cab. The fireman adjusted quickly, tamping down hot spots, opening dampers or closing them, watching the flames and gauges with practiced eyes. The cab grew warmer. Sweat ran down his face and soaked his shirt. The smell of smoke and burning coal was thick and never left, clinging to the skin and clothes like a second layer. Yet the fireman worked silently, his focus absolute. This was his domain, the inferno that powered the iron beast. Outside, workers in the yard moved about, the station slowly coming to life. The train's whistle blew again, sharp and clear, a signal that the engine was ready. Inside the cab, the fire roared steadily now. The fireman raked the grate one last time, spreading coal evenly across the glowing bed. The pressure gauge steadied near full operating pressure. The driver gave a small nod, eyes scanning the instruments. The fireman wiped his brow and took a deep breath. The fire was alive, fierce, and steady, the beating heart of the machine. The fireman knew that this fire was more than heat. It was transformation, the raw energy that turned water into steam and steam into movement, a power older than the rails themselves. The firebox was a furnace, a crucible, a living furnace fueled by coal and air, tended by the steady hand of the fireman. It was a ritual repeated every day, a dance of flame and fuel that brought the iron giant to life. The fireman felt the rhythm deep in his bones, the rise and fall of the flames, the crackle of burning coal, the steady pulse of steam pressure building in the boiler. This was the fire in the belly, the fierce and untamed heart that drove the train forward. As the engine began to move, slowly at first, then with growing confidence, the fireman stayed vigilant. The flames roared, the coal glowed, and the heat pressed against the metal walls. The fire was a living thing, fierce, demanding, and beautiful. The fireman was its keeper, its guardian, and its soul. And in that fiery heart, the iron beast found its strength and its purpose. The boiler was the giant's lungs and heart combined. A vast steel cylinder, heavy and thick, encased in layers of insulation and riveted plates, designed to withstand immense pressure, yet hold water that began cold and lifeless. It was inside this massive vessel that water was transformed into the invisible force that moved the train steam. Too low, and the metal walls could overheat and warp. Too high, and water might flood the cylinders, risking damage. Maintaining the water level was a delicate act, demanding constant attention. The fireman's breath held steady, fingers adjusting the dampers to feed the fire with just enough oxygen. The pressure had to rise steadily, neither too slow nor too fast. A hiss or a sudden puff from these valves was a warning the engine was pushing its limits, and the fireman and driver had to adjust the fire and throttle carefully. A sudden spike could mean disaster-ruptured pipes, exploded valves, or worse. Injectors were a marvel of steam engineering, using steam itself to pump water into the boiler against its rising pressure. Heat from the firebox passed through the boiler's inner walls, turning water into steam that gathered above the liquid in the boiler's dome. Steam pressure pushed down on the water's surface, increasing with the heat and energy below. The entire vessel was a battleground of forces, steel holding back the desperate pressure of expanding steam. They also served as safety devices, warning of pressure buildup or signaling departure. It was a strange but elegant cycle. Steam powered the injector that fed water to make more steam. Steam hissed and spat from small release valves, condensing instantly in the cool morning air into white clouds that drifted upward. The firemen adjusted the firebox's dampers accordingly, increasing airflow to stoke the flames or closing them to dampen the heat. The sound of the engine was a symphony of pressure and release, metal creaking under stress, valves opening and closing with rhythmic precision. This power would soon be released, driving pistons, turning wheels, moving tons of metal along steel tracks. The process was simple in theory, but exacting and perilous in practice. The firemen reacted quickly, easing back on the fire, closing dampers slightly, adjusting injectors. The pressure needle stabilized. This invisible force was the secret behind the iron giant's strength. What looked like simple water was actually a vast reservoir of energy held in tension, waiting to be unleashed. The fireman's steady hand on the controls ensured that this power stayed under control, never spilling over into danger. Water levels, steam pressure, fire intensity, throttle position, all interconnected. This transformation was the engine's secret weapon, the key to turning the raw energy of coal and fire into unstoppable motion. The fireman and driver worked as one, monitoring gauges, controlling fire and water, managing steam pressure like two conductors leading a complex orchestra. Every part designed to contain unimaginable forces to protect the crew and the machine. The fireman and driver were its keepers, guardians of the delicate balance between cold water and deadly steam pressure. The pressure inside was invisible, but brutal, pushing outward relentlessly. The power of the boiler was immense and unpredictable if left unchecked. The iron giant moved forward, carrying with it the strength of fire, water, and human will. His muscles ached from the heat and labor, but his focus never wavered. The firemen continued feeding coal and monitoring injectors, ensuring the water level never dipped too low. The train roared, a moving mountain of iron and steam, powered by the invisible force inside the boiler. This was a constant battle between fire, water, and metal, a balance maintained by skill, knowledge, and respect for the immense forces at play. One wrong move could spell disaster. Too little water, and the boiler could overheat, leading to metal fatigue or a dangerous explosion. Too much water, and the cylinders could flood, causing a hydraulic lock that would ruin the pistons. The sight glass showed a steady rise, water replenished, steam pressure maintained. The driver felt the power responding instantly. Wheels gripping the rails, the train surging forward. The pressure gauge remained steady, a constant heartbeat of power. The firebox blazed beneath the giant cylinder, an endless furnace. The fireman adjusted the flow, careful not to flood the boiler with too much cold water at once. The needle hovered, trembling as if alive. The fireman adjusted the fire, adding coal to maintain the steady heat needed to sustain this pressure. Suddenly cooling the hot boiler walls could cause them to crack, a dangerous stress that could lead to failure. These gauges spoke a language of power and danger. Their readings watched obsessively. At rest, the boiler's pressure was near zero, but as the fire roared below and heat transferred to the water, the pressure began to climb. The throttle controlled how much steam was sent to the pistons, the engine's muscles. Opening it released more steam, increasing power and speed. Closing it throttled the engine, slowing the train. The driver watched the pressure gauges closely, knowing that pushing the throttle too far with low water levels or unstable pressure could cause catastrophic damage. Steam trapped inside the boiler was compressed to dozens of pounds per square inch, pressing outward against the steel walls, seeking escape. The boiler was designed to contain this force, but only up to a limit. The firebox's fierce heat beneath the boiler heated the metal walls relentlessly. Water surrounded these walls, trapped inside the boiler's belly, pressed into a thin layer by the tight, curved steel. Cold water entered the boiler through carefully placed injectors, its arrival monitored by the fireman and driver alike. The temperature was low at first, near freezing on chilly mornings, but that water was about to undergo an incredible transformation. Inside the cab, the fireman kept a close eye on the sight glass, an upright transparent tube attached to the boiler side that showed the water level. Alongside the sight glass were rows of pressure gauges, brass and glass instruments with needles twitching and sweeping in precise arcs. The needle moved slowly at first, then faster. 10 pounds per square inch, 20, 30. Steam pressure was the lifeblood of the engine. The hotter the water, the more pressure it created. Safety valves crowned the boiler, gleaming metal domes set to release steam if the pressure became too high. The fireman reached out to a lever that controlled the injector's devices that forced cold water into the boiler under pressure. The water entered in a fine, steady stream, visible in the sight glass, replenishing what had boiled away. Inside the boiler, the water boiled furiously. The driver, sitting beside the fireman, kept a hand on the throttle. The pressure gauge climbed steadily toward the engine as operating limit, often around 180 pounds per square inch for a typical steam locomotive. Steam whistles on the boiler's top let out sharp, piercing call signals to the outside world that the engine was alive and ready. The cab was thick with heat and the smell of burning coal. The fireman's job was a constant battle of balance. The pressure gauge was the fireman's compass. He learned to read its subtle changes, the slight hesitation of the needle, the sudden jump, the steady climb. Boiler pressure was a story of transformation. Cold water heated into steam, steam compressed to incredible pressures, power stored invisibly in gas. The fireman worked the injectors again, increasing water flow carefully to maintain the perfect level. As the train began to move, steam hissed and pumped through pipes to the pistons. Inside the cab, every valve and lever was alive with energy and risk. Occasionally, the pressure would spike. Safety valves hissed, releasing bursts of steam with sharp whistles. Cold water in a thin, steady stream entered the boiler, meeting the boiling heat, transforming silently and invisibly into powerful steam. The boiler was a marvel of engineering: riveted plates, heavy steel, fire bricks lining the interior. Outside the cab, steam curled and billowed from the safety valves and exhaust stacks. The train was alive with power. He wiped sweat from his brow, eyes never leaving the pressure gauge and sight glass. The water in the boiler had traveled an incredible journey from cold and lifeless to boiling, pressurized steam. The train began to pick up speed, the pistons pumping steam with relentless rhythm. Pressure remained steady, carefully controlled. The driver eased the throttle forward, feeling the full power of the steam surge through the cylinders. Every gauge, valve, and lever was part of a living system, a complex dance of elements that demanded constant attention and expertise. In the heat of the cab, with sweat stinging his eyes and the roar of the firebox filling his ears, the fireman knew that control was everything. But with skill and vigilance, the fireman kept that power harness transforming cold water into steam, steam into motion, and motion into progress. And the journey had only just begun. The cab of a steam engine was a world unto itself, a cramped, iron-walled cockpit filled with levers, dials, valves, and gauges, each a vital instrument in a delicate dance of control and power. To an outsider, it might look like a jumble of brass and steel, a confusing maze of knobs and wheels. But to the driver and fireman, these controls spoke a language of their own, a language forged in decades of experience, shaped by feel, sound, and instinct. At the center of it all was the throttle, a lever with a solid, reassuring weight, a gateway to the engine's soul. The throttle controlled how much steam flowed from the boiler into the cylinders, the very pulse of power that drove the pistons and wheels. A gentle squeeze sent a whisper of steam forward. A sharp push unleashed a roar. The largest of these was the boiler pressure dial, its needle a constant companion to the driver and fireman. At rest, it sat near zero. As the fire grew fierce, the needle climbed steadily 50, 100, 180 pounds per square inch. The driver would glance at it often, as naturally as breathing. A sudden spike, a drop, a hesitation each was a message demanding attention. Too low, and the engine lacked power. Too high, and danger loomed. The brake valve was the engine's hand on the train's throat, controlling the powerful vacuum or air brakes that slowed or stopped the massive iron giant. It required finesse. A sudden, heavy application could cause wheels to lock and skid, damaging track and equipment. Too light, and the train might not slow enough to stop safely. The driver's hand turned it slowly, feeling the resistance build, hearing the hiss of escaping air, sensing the train's response through the controls. The pistons responded with a deep, powerful clank that shook the cab floor. The pressure gauge needle steadied, the boiler working efficiently within safe limits. The driver felt the engine's muscles flex, wheels gripping the rails with a steady, driving force. The fireman glanced at the gauges, monitoring water levels and steam pressure while feeding the fire with steady coal. It told the story of the fire's strength, the water's heat, and the engine's readiness. The brake valve was turned gradually, the hiss of compressed air filling the cab as the train began to slow. The pressure gauge dipped slightly, steam use reduced, but pressure maintained. The driver's hand was steady, feeling the train respond beneath him. The driver listened closely, feeling the machine's breath through the controls. The fireman began tending the fire, adding coal to maintain heat. Even at rest, the pressure gauge hovered just above zero. The firebox hissed with residual steam, and the brake valve waited silently for its next command. The driver closed the throttle fully, set the reverser to neutral, and eased the brake valve until the train was safely still. Each lever, dial, and valve was an extension of their will, a tool for shaping raw power into controlled motion. The train was moving smoothly, but the driver's eyes never left the instruments. Breathing machine one that carried people and goods across vast distances, bridging towns and landscapes with fire, water, and steel. It was a language learned by doing, by countless hours in the cab, by respect for the power beneath the metal skin. The reverser ratcheted gently as it found each notch, its handle smooth but precise. The pressure gauge's needle twitched with every change, and the brake valve hissed and hissed, its soft groan warning of the slowing train. He knew that conditions could change in an instant, track signals, obstacles, or steep descents requiring immediate braking. The driver and fireman knew that every movement could mean the difference between smooth progress and disaster. The hiss of steam escaping from valves, the rhythmic chuff of the cylinders, the creak of metal under stress, the low whistle signaling movement. These sounds were the language of the engine, a continuous conversation between man and machine. The driver's hand rested lightly on the throttle, fingers curled around the worn wood handle, the smooth metal shining beneath. Moving the throttle was like coaxing a wild stallion too little, and the engine would stall, losing momentum. Too much, and the wheels might slip on the rails, wasting precious traction and risking damage. The driver's hand knew these notches by feel, shifting the lever slowly and deliberately. It was a delicate dance, too sharp a movement, and the valve gear could jam. Too slow, and the engine would waste steam or respond sluggishly. Pulling it back shortened the cutoff, allowing steam to expand inside the cylinders, saving fuel but reducing power. It was a balance between speed and economy, acceleration and endurance. Each movement had a sound, a faint hiss as the valve opened, steam rushing through pipes with a sharp whoosh, the deep clunk of pistons responding. The reverser dictated the engine as direction and controlled the cut-off the point in the piston as stroke, where steam admission was cut off and expansion began. It was the master of efficiency, speed, and control. Beside the throttle sat the reverser, a lever no less important, though far more subtle in its command. Pushing the reverser forward sent the engine hurtling ahead, the pistons powered by fresh steam for longer strokes. The reverser's handle was smooth, worn by years of use, its position marked by notches on a metal plate. Pressure gauges were scattered across the cab's dashboard, brass instruments with glass faces, needles sweeping in arcs like living creatures. The needle danced between safe zones and warning ranges, its movement small but meaningful. The gauges ticking and clicking were part of the cab's rhythm. Near the pressure gauge was the brake valve, another vital control with a tactile presence. Turning the brake valve released pressure into the brake pipes, pressing brake shoes against wheels with grinding force. The brake valve's handle was large and round, made for firm grip even in gloves thick with grime. Each of these instruments, the throttle, reverser, pressure gauge, brake valve, had a feel that was more than physical. They carried the weight of responsibility. The cab was alive with sounds. The throttle moved forward slowly, releasing a controlled torrent of steam. The reverser was adjusted slightly, shortening the cutoff to conserve steam as the train climbed a gentle grade. The brake valve remained still for now. In the dim light of the cab, the brass handles gleamed faintly, their worn surfaces polished by years of hands that had controlled the engine's fate. Together, driver and fireman spoke a language without words or glance, a nod, a shared understanding of the levers and dials that governed their world. The throttle was eased back as the train approached a station, steam flow reduced and pistons slowing their furious pace. The reverser was moved back toward neutral, shortening the cutoff further as the engine slowed. Every control had a specific sound, a feel, a resistance that told the driver how the engine was reacting. The throttle, heavy with steam pressure, had a solid, reassuring click as it moved through its range. Mist curled around the cab windows as the engine came to a stop, but the language of levers and gauges never stopped speaking. To the driver and fireman, this language was more than mechanical. It was a connection to the iron beast's heart. In the hands of skilled men, the language of levers and gauges turned cold metal and boiling steam into a living. And in that language lay the secret of the iron giant's might balance, respect, and the human touch guiding overwhelming power with careful hands. The steam engine was a giant of iron and fire, but it was also a team, two men, bound by trust, skill, and a shared mission. The engineer and the fireman together breathed life into the iron beast, eyes sharp and hands steady on the controls. His world was the throttle, thick with heat and noise. The roar of the firebox filled the air. Shoveling coal was no easy task. It was heavy, dirty work demanding strength and stamina. Each handful of coal was lifted from the tender, tossed into the firebox with precision. The fire had to be fed steadily but carefully. His eyes flicked constantly from gauges to track, from signals to controls. His hands moved with confidence, adjusting the throttle, shifting the reverser, modulating the brakes. He was the captain, the one responsible for the train's safety and speed. Too much coal at once could smother the flames. Too little, and the fire would falter. Steam hissed through pipes. The fireman might catch the engineer's eye and nod as he adjusted the fire. The steam engine was unforgiving, and mistakes could be catastrophic. The fireman endured the heat, the heavy coal, the constant dust and soot. His work was exhausting, requiring strength and endurance. Tools, controls, gauges, and pipes crowded the small chamber. Movement was limited, but every action was precise and efficient. The engineer's concentration was unrelenting, his senses sharp to the sounds and movements of the engine and track. The engineer might flash a quick thumbs up as he eased back the throttle. Signals flashed in the distance, demanding attention and response. He shifted the reverser slightly, adjusting steam cutoff to conserve fuel on the upcoming incline. The engineer's was pressure and speed, control and safety. The fireman shoveled faster, building steam pressure to meet the challenge. The engineer's hands moved quicker, balancing throttle and brake, adjusting reverser to optimize power and control. The engineer's eyes burned with concentration, his hands steady but ready to react instantly. But in the cab's cramped space, these worlds overlapped, fused by the roaring iron giant they commanded. The engineer's hands turned the valve slowly, listening to the hiss of compressed air and feeling the train's response. His arms burned with exertion, muscles straining with every shovel. The engineer eased the throttle back slightly, the pressure gauge steady, the train rolling smoothly over the rails. The men were bonded by the shared struggle, the relentless demands of the machine and the journey. The heat was relentless, pressing against skin and bones. And steam, who wrestled power into motion, who carried the weight of iron and steel across miles of track. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. Yet he moved with practiced rhythm, feeding the fire as if guided by instinct. He worked alongside the roaring flames, his face lit by their orange glow, the heat blistering his skin. And strength, trust, and timing, a bond formed in the heat and noise of the cab. The fireman's shoveling, the engineer's throttle adjustments, the steady climb of pressure on the gauges, all parts of a living system they controlled with skill and care. He wiped sweat from his brow and added coal again, keeping the fire steady. They exchanged a brief glance, a nod of shared understanding. The engine was alive, powerful, and under control, and metal groaned under strain. The temperature rose quickly. The cab filled with the sounds of the engine, the hiss of steam, the clatter of pistons, the creak of metal under stress. The engineer might glance over, silently acknowledging the effort, before returning his focus to the controls. The fireman trusted the engineer to use that power wisely, to steer the train safely and effectively. Each depended on the other's skill and vigilance. Each movement was deliberate, informed by knowledge and experience. The engineer felt the engine respond beneath him, the vibrations through the floor, the roar of pistons, the pull of momentum, turning the cab into an oven. Every breath was thick with smoke and coal dust. The air was heavy, moving within this harsh environment as if it were home. The reverser, years of working side by side, had forged a language of glances. Gestures, a nod from the engineer might signal a call for more steam. A slight shift in position could mean the throttle was about to move. The fireman watched the pressure gauges and the sight glass, feeling the fire's pulse and anticipating the engineer's commands before they came. The brake valve and the chorus of gauges that told the story of the engine's strength. Every flick of a lever, every glance at a dial, was part of a silent conversation with the machine. The engineer was the mind, the strategist, the one who steered the beast forward with calm command, each playing a vital role in the dance of power. The fireman was the heart. His domain was the firebox and the coal tender, the intense heat that transformed cold water into living steam. The fireman's job was relentless and physical, shoveling coal in a rhythm dictated by the fire's hunger and the engineer's needs. His hands were raw, his skin slick with sweat, his clothes heavy with soot. He was the engine's lifeblood, feeding the inferno that powered their journey. Heat. Their partnership was one forged in sweat and sound, in smoke and silence, in the cramped and roaring cab where every movement counted. The engineer sat to the right. To his left, the cab itself was a furnace, a confined space carved from steel. Communication between engineer and fireman was rarely spoken. The fireman's body was in constant motion. The fireman's hands were blistered, fingers blackened with soot. The engineer's role was no less demanding, though quieter and more cerebral. The throttle lever was an extension of his will, the reverse of the key to direction and power. The brake valve required the utmost finesse. Applying the brakes too suddenly risked locking wheels and skidding. Too lightly, and the train might fail to stop in time. Together, engineer and fireman were a team of contrasts, the brain and the muscle, the calm and the fury, the measured and the relentless. Their partnership was built on trust. The engineer trusted the fireman to keep the firebox blazing, to feed the inferno just right to build steam pressure. The cab was noisy, but the men's communication was quiet glances exchanged in seconds, small gestures, a tilt of the head. This silent dialogue was essential. There was no room for confusion or hesitation. The physical demands on both men were immense. The cab's space was tight, barely enough room for two men to move without brushing shoulders. The fireman adjusted the fire grate, raking ashes and clinker to keep air flowing. The engineer checked the pressure gauge, then glanced at the track ahead through the cab's small windows. The fireman caught the motion and added a handful of coal, feeding the flames just as the engineer needed more power. At times, the fireman had to lean far forward to shovel coal deep into the firebox, muscles burning, lungs filled with hot air and smoke. The two men moved together in rhythm, their actions intertwined in a choreography born of necessity and experience. The fireman's world was fire and fuel, heat and sweat. When the train faced steep grades or sharp curves, the intensity of their work increased. The cab became a furnace and a cockpit, a place of heat, noise, and motion, where every second demanded focus and skill. Sometimes the fireman's hands trembled from exhaustion, his clothes soaked with sweat, but he never faltered. The fireman shoveled coal one last time as the engine reached cruising speed, the firebox glowing bright and steady. The engine room was alive, not just with heat and fire, but with sound. A roaring symphony composed of metal, steam, and motion. It was a place where the language of iron was spoken in clangs and hisses, groans and whistles. To stand inside, it was to be surrounded by the heartbeat of the iron giant itself. The first sound was the breath, the low, steady hiss of steam escaping from safety valves. It was the signature of the steam locomotive, the constant push and pull of power and resistance, a living heartbeat of pistons and rods. The pressure valves released steam with sharp, high-pitched calls, a warning, a signal, a declaration. The regulator valves hissed and clicked as they adjusted the flow of steam to the cylinders. The sounds were a constant presence. The whistle atop the boiler could scream across the landscape, sharp and piercing, calling out to distant towns and signaling departure. But within the engine room, it was the softer, mechanical sounds that dominated. That the hiss of steam might indicate a valve release, a sudden clank could warn of mechanical trouble. The groan of metal could signal overheating or strain. It was a constant undercurrent, a sigh of pressure held at the edge of release. The roar of the flames, the crackle of burning coal, the hiss of steam injectors, all were part of his awareness. The hiss and groan echoed like ghosts. The clanks and chuffs, a heartbeat in the darkness. The fire's glow cast flickering shadows on the walls, the sounds wrapping around the men like a living presence. They were conductors of steam and steel, masters of the breathing, groaning, hissing life within the engine room. He tuned himself to the engine's voice, responding with coal and air to keep the symphony in balance. The engineer and fireman listened closely, their senses sharpened by experience. Pounding, they formed patterns and rhythms, crescendos and decrescendos, a mechanical music that told the story of power and motion. The noise was deafening to outsiders, but familiar to those who worked inside. It was a language understood by the fireman and engineer. Of the cylinders was hypnotic, each piston's forward thrust, accompanied by the hiss of steam release and the slam of valve. Gear. The sound was almost musical, a repeating pattern that marked time and power. The boiler flexed and strained, thick plates pushing against rivets and bolts. The sound was slow and deliberate, like an ancient giant waking from slumber, bones shifting beneath skin of iron. The engine groaned louder, a soft sigh from the boiler as pressure stabilized. The sound of grease and oil lubricating the moving parts was faint but present, subtle sizzle and drip that kept the machine running smoothly. Each sound was part of a conversation, a message from the engine's core, a warning that strain was increasing. The fireman adjusted dampers, and the engineer eased the throttle, responding to the subtle changes in the symphony. The sounds were their guide, telling them when the fire needed feeding, when steam pressure was rising too fast, when the machine demanded respect. The steam escaped in controlled bursts, like the engine exhaling after a deep, powerful breath. Each hiss was sharp, sudden, and fading into a soft whisper. The fireman's tools scraped and rattled, adding percussion to the symphony, metal rattling against metal. The smell of burning coal mixed with the sound, completing the sensory immersion. Alongside the breath came the groans of steel the deep, creaking moans that echoed through the frame as metal expanded under heat. The sound of wheels against rails joined the symphony, the steady clatter of steel wheels rolling over steel tracks. The clickety-clack varied with speed, growing louder and more urgent as the train accelerated. The rods and pistons provided a clanking rhythm, a steady percussion that marked the engine's pulse. Each piston moved with purpose, driven by the power of steam. The rods connected pistons to wheels, translating force into motion. Their clatter was loud and insistent, metal striking metal in a relentless cadence. The rhythmic chug of the engine filled the room, a steady, hypnotic sound that grew louder as speed increased. Interwoven with these were the whistles and sighs of valves. The firebox door added its own voice, a sharp clang when slammed, the creak of hinges opening and closing, a sudden roar as fresh air fed the flames. Inside the cab, rhythmic. The metal walls of the cab and engine room vibrated with these sounds. The clanks and hisses reverberated, amplified by the enclosed steel space. At times, the hiss of steam was constant, but varied, a gentle whistle from the injector, a sudden burst from a safety valve. The rods struck against each other with sharp clanks. The valve gears snapped into place with metallic clicks. The fireman's shovel scraped against coal and grate, adding a harsh scraping to the soundscape. The firebox door slammed open and closed. Outside the cab, the engineer listened to every sound, using the auditory cues to manage the engine. The fireman, surrounded by heat and noise, relied on sound to judge the fire's strength. The sounds inside the engine room were relentless, but never random. At night, with the world outside silent and dark, the engine sounds took on a haunting quality. Every sound had meaning. A hiss might warn of rising pressure. A clank might signal a valve shifting. A groan might remind of metal's limits. Together, they interpreted the symphony, guiding the iron giant safely along its path. Beneath the floor of the cab, hidden from immediate view but never from feeling, a mechanical ballet unfolded. It was a complex dance of iron and steam, a symphony of moving parts that transformed raw, boiling power into the graceful, relentless motion of wheels on steel rails. This was the engine's heart in motion, pistons pumping, rods swinging, wheels turning, all synchronized in perfect rhythm. When steam entered the cylinder, it pushed the piston forward with immense force. This forward thrust was raw power, a burst of energy that needed direction and control. Steam, invisible yet potent, was the prime mover. It began its journey inside the boiler, where heat from the firebox transformed cold water into a high-pressure gas eager to escape. This steam was channeled through pipes to the cylinder's massive, thick-walled chambers mounted near the locomotive's frame. Inside each cylinder, the dance truly began. Their movement was both powerful and graceful, a constant, mesmerizing rhythm that could be felt as a vibration through the cab floor. The piston, a heavy iron plug, sat snugly within the cylinder, its surface polished smooth from years of movement. These wheels translated the piston's force into forward motion, their steel rims gripping the rails with friction and precision. The rhythmic chug of pistons striking and rods swinging filled the air, a mechanical heartbeat echoing through the locomotive's frame. These wheels were free to pivot and move, adjusting to track conditions, while the driving wheels provided the pulling power. Attached to the piston was a connecting rod, a sturdy, forged piece of steel designed to withstand pounding forces. Engineers and firemen monitored the sounds and vibrations, feeling for irregularities that might signal trouble. The engineer could adjust the cutoff by moving the reverser, changing when valves emitted steam. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical, a repeating pattern that drove the locomotive forward mile after mile. The engineer might open the throttle wide. The engineer eased back. Rails were not perfectly smooth. Energy channeled into a perfect flow of motion. Unaware of the complexity beneath, the dance was ever present. They felt every stroke and rotation through floorboards and controls. Craftsmanship and human ingenuity harnessing the forces of nature. They heard the clank and hiss and rhythmic thud, the music of movement. They felt the steady hum and gentle vibration, the steady push forward, but not the intricate dance of pistons and rods making it possible. And the locomotive had to flex and move in response. Springs and bearings helped smooth motion, while the moving rods and pistons adjusted in microseconds. Steel moving against steel, steam pushing iron in a never-ending cycle. It was a ballet of power and precision, strength and grace, allowing the momentum to carry the train while controlling speed with brakes. The piston's motion slowed, rods moving in a gentler, more relaxed rhythm, demanding more steam and power. The pistons would push harder, rods swinging with greater force. The wheels gripped the rails fiercely, churning slowly but steadily uphill. Powerful rhythm driving the iron giant forward across miles of track, through valleys and mountains, cities and countryside. This allowed for more power when needed or greater efficiency when cruising. The rod translated the piston's linear motion into rotational force. Pistons slammed forward, rods swung in wider arcs, and wheels turned faster. Raw power sculpted into a graceful dance that carried the world on its wheels. The entire locomotive was alive with motion, a coordinated dance of iron and steam. Their pins and bearings were lubricated constantly, oiled by the injector that sprayed thick black grease onto moving parts. When one piston was pushed forward, another was pulling back, smoothing the engine's motion and preventing jolts or stalls. It linked to the driving wheels, those enormous iron discs that gripped the rails and propelled the locomotive forward. As the piston pushed forward, the rod swung outward and down, turning the driving wheel a fraction of a revolution. Then, as steam pressure shifted, the piston was pulled back, the rod moving in the opposite arc, turning the wheel further. The valves controlled steam admission and exhaust, opening and closing with precise timing to ensure steam entered and exited the cylinder at the right moments. This valve gear was a marvel of engineering linkages, cams, and rods working together like clockwork. This back and forth motion repeated hundreds of times each minute, creating a continuous rotation. But the dance was far from simple. Each cylinder worked in sequence, pistons moving out of phase with each other to provide steady power and balance. The rods connecting pistons to wheels were polished and oiled, sliding smoothly as they swung through arcs of motion. The driving wheels themselves were massive, often 6 feet or more in diameter, mounted on axles that carried the locomotive as weight. The wheels rotated slowly at first, then faster, picking up speed as steam pressure increased and the throttle was opened further. Supporting wheels at the front and rear balanced the engine, guiding it smoothly along curves and grades. The valve gear was visible beneath the locomotive, an intricate array of rods and linkages moving in perfect harmony. As the throttle was eased forward, steam rushed into the cylinders with increasing force. Every link and joint had to be perfectly maintained. Worn parts could cause slipping, jamming, or loss of power. The connecting rods were balanced to prevent excessive wear and vibration. The motion beneath the floor was more than raw power. It was controlled energy, flowing through metal joints and steel plates with precision. During climbs, on descents, the dance also absorbed shocks from track irregularities. The mechanical ballet beneath the floor was the engine's secret, what made raw steam into smooth, relentless progress. It was power harnessed by design and skill. Passengers and cargo rode smoothly above. For those who worked the engine room was a place of constant motion. Each revolution of the driving wheels marked a victory of engineering, a triumph of design. The piston's dance was eternal and measured. This was the heart of the steam locomotive, fire and water transformed into motion. And as long as the pistons pumped and rods swung, the engine lived, breathing life into steel and steam, moving forward with unstoppable force and elegant precision. Life inside the cab of a steam engine was a trial by fire, a furnace of relentless heat, choking dust, and unyielding physical toil. It was a place where the elements were concentrated and intensified, where every breath was heavy with coal smoke, and every muscle burned with exertion. The firebox blazed just a few feet away, its roaring inferno pushing waves of scorching air through the cramped space. Each shovel full of coal was heavy, black, and dusty, and had to be thrown into the blazing fire with precision and rhythm. Metal surfaces radiated heat so intense they seemed almost too hot to touch. For the men who worked there, the cab was both workplace and crucible, a world apart, harsh and unforgiving. The first thing that struck anyone entering the cab was the heat. It pressed down like a physical weight, thick and suffocating. His face was streaked with soot and grime, coal dust settling into every pore. Long shifts meant hours standing or crouching amid the heat and noise, muscles burning from constant work and tension. There was no pause, no break. The fire demanded constant feeding. The controls required constant watching. His hands, though sweaty, maintained steady control over levers and valves. Concentration was a battle against the draining heat. The air inside the cab was hot and dry one moment, then filled with choking coal dust the next. The sweat poured freely, but replenishing fluids was difficult. The physical toll was immense. His eyes often stone, watering from smoke and sweat. Yet he moved with practiced rhythm, muscle memory guiding each shovel, each toss of fuel into the flames. But there was no rest for long hours of feeding the fire and maintaining steam pressure stretched ahead. The fireman felt the fire's heat on his back and face, the metal firebox glowing red hot. It was a brutal place, punishing but vital. Tools and controls had to be handled carefully, despite slick hands and exhaustion. The constant noise and heat blurred time and senses. The fireman's rhythm became steady, almost meditative, the endless cycle of shovel, toss, rake, repeat. Passengers riding the train knew none of this struggle, only the smooth ride and steady progress. The engineer's focus sharpened through years of practice, every gauge and lever second nature. The constant barrage of sound added to the mental strain. Talking was rare, voices harsh and strained when they came. The men communicated mostly with glances and gestures. The fireman's lungs burned, his chest heaved with effort. The men worked by the glow of gauges and small lamps, muscles aching, senses strained. Yet there was no escaping the furnace, no relief from the sweltering heat that wrapped around him like a second skin. But it was also a vital part of a larger journey powering the iron giant that linked towns and cities, carried goods and people, and shaped the modern world. The air tasted bitter, thick with smoke and ash. The engineer's shirt was stained and damp, a map of the harsh environment. Neither man could fully escape the grime of their world. The fireman worked closest to this furnace heart. His job was to feed the firebox with coal, a task that required strength, stamina, and constant attention. It was an invisible enemy, abrasive and persistent. The heat was relentless. The fireman's skin was slick with sweat almost immediately. His clothes clung damp and heavy. The cab itself was a metal box heated by the fire's glow. Hands slick with sweat sometimes lost grip on controls, forcing extra care. The cab floor was slick with coal dust and grime, and every surface was coated with a fine layer of soot. Every surface absorbed and radiated warmth, turning the small space into an oven. The engineer's clothes were soaked with sweat, his skin flushed and damp. Breathing was a challenge. The engineer, though somewhat removed from the firebox, was not spared. Moving in the cab was difficult. Space was tight, and the heat sapped strength and energy. Every movement felt heavier, more exhausting. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The fireman's arms ached from shoveling coal, repetitive, heavy motions that taxed muscles and joints. His hands blistered and cracked from heat and grit. The engineer's focus never wavered. His mind fought the haze of heat and exhaustion, tracking steam pressure, throttle, brakes, and track signals. The cab was noisy. Steam hissed and roared. Metal groaned and clanked. Hydration was crucial but scarce. Water carried from station stops was sipped sparingly. Coal dust was a constant companion, fine particles floating in shafts of sunlight through the cab windows, settling on skin and clothes, clogging lungs and throats. The fireman's face was smeared black from soot and sweat, coal dust darkening every crease. At times, the heat became unbearable. The fireman might pause briefly, leaning back to catch breath, wiping sweat from his brow. The firebox itself was a roaring furnace, flames licking at coal and grate, sending waves of heat into the cab. The sweat soaked into gloves and shirt, stung eyes, and made grips slippery. Fatigue crept in slowly but surely. Muscles burned, legs ached from standing, backs ached from leaning into the firebox. Yet the men endured. Their bodies adapted, conditioned by experience and necessity. The cab was a world apart from the cool air outside, the stark contrast between furnace and landscape, stark and unforgiving. Night brought little relief. The cab stayed hot and noisy, the fire still burning fiercely. Sometimes a breeze might drift through open windows, offering a brief respite. But even then, the heat and dust clung stubbornly. The long hours tested endurance and will. The men had no choice but to push on, sustaining the fire, guiding the engine, moving ever forward. Their work was hard, dirty, exhausting. In the heat of the cab, amid sweat and dust, the steam engine lived and breathed, its heart fueled by coal, its power harnessed by men who endured the furnace with strength and skill. Inside the cab of a steam locomotive, Amid the swirling smoke and clattering metal, words were scarce but meaningful. The roar of the engine was ever present, a constant backdrop that swallowed most speech. Their communication was often minimal, a glance, a nod, a quick gesture, but when words did come, they were deliberate, sharp, and often laced with dry humor. The fireman might break the silence with a quiet observation about the weather, the track ahead, or the stubborn fire demanding more coal. Yet in those brief pockets of quiet, between hisses and clanks, the crew found space to share stories, jokes, and observations. Often these were gruff, working-class jabs at the hardships of the job or at the eccentricities of fellow railwaymen. These conversations wove a subtle thread through the noise, binding men together in the harsh, demanding world of steam and steel. The fireman and engineer were more than colleagues. They were companions thrown together in a confined, intense environment. During the long stretches of travel, when the train rolled steadily over the rails and the engine's roar settled into a steady hum, the men spoke softly, said the track was washed out, cause of the floods. Took 3 days to clear, but the boss had us hauling coal anyway. Sighed she-hold. But last week, he ran out of breath shoveling his own supper. The rhythm of the train, the hiss of steam, and the clatter of rods spoke volumes on their own. Last winter, froze my fingers off on a night run. But you keep moving, don't you? Voices were low and rough, shaped by years of shouting over whistles and clanks. The engine's roar was the only constant companion, a mechanical heartbeat that demanded attention. The cab would fill briefly with voices discussing schedules, weather, or the next leg of the journey. Watch the gauge. The engineer would nod, adjusting controls without breaking his gaze from the dials. You reckon this heat'll ever quit? The fireman might mutter, wiping sweat from his brow. The engineer, eyes on the gauges, would respond with a grunt or a wry smile, acknowledging the unrelenting furnace that was their daily reality. These stories were not grand adventures, but small moments that carried the weight of experience. Words were fewer than silences, but when spoken, they carried the weight of experience and shared hardship. These moments brought a touch of the outside world into the hot, confined space. Used to be a bustling place. Now it's just rust and memories. Tracks get pulled up, towns fade, but the train keeps running. The men worked as one, each anticipating the other's needs. When the engineer eased the reverser, the fireman knew to adjust the fire accordingly. Boiler blows, and that's the end of us. Jokes were a rare relief, quick, sharp bursts of humor that cut through the fatigue. Did you hear about McGregor? Swore he could out-shovel a steam shovel, the fireman might say with a smirk. The engineer might chuckle, the sound swallowed quickly by the engine's growl, but enough to bring a brief flicker of lightness to the oppressive heat. And travel, that the iron beast carried towns, goods, and lives forward, and the rare, precious language of understanding spoken between the clanks and clouds of smoke. The men sometimes stared into the firebox's glowing heart or out the fogged windows, lost in thought amid the engine's roar. We'll have to ease up on the throttle. Stories were shared in bits and pieces, tales from past runs, near misses, and the strange characters met along the line. They thought of long days ahead, of the unending task of feeding fire and controlling steam. The men were keenly aware that every decision mattered, that a misjudged throttle or a poorly tended fire could have serious consequences. There was a freight crew down near Bendigo, the engineer might say quietly. The fireman would listen, nodding, eyes narrowed against the dust and smoke. I've seen worse. Between stories and jokes, silence often stretched long. It was a silence filled with focus, watching gauges, feeding the fire, adjusting the throttle. Through smoke and sound, they shared stories, laughter, warnings, and quiet moments, threads that wove connection amid isolation. Sometimes the silence was comfortable, almost companionable. The men didn't need to fill the air with words. But when conversation came, It was sharp and deliberate, each word chosen carefully to be heard above the noise. The fireman might offer a quick piece of advice or a warning. Pressure was climbing fast. At rare moments when the engine slowed or stopped at stations, crossings, or signal points, the noise abated enough for fuller conversation. "Looks like rain coming up near Seymour," the engineer might say, glancing out a window fogged with steam. "Track gets slippery." The fireman grunted agreement, already preparing to tend the fire for the extra work ahead. Their conversations also carried a shared understanding of danger and responsibility. "You know what happens if that pressure spikes too high?" the fireman said once, voice low and tense. The engineer's reply was grim but steady. "That's why we keep watch every minute. No mistakes." Amid the smoke and noise, these exchanges built trust, a fragile but vital bond. Occasionally, the fireman might comment on the scenery rushing past, the changing landscape, the towns and fields glimpsed through the cab windows. "See that old mill by the river?" the fireman might say. The engineer would glance briefly, his mind always partly on the engine, and reply quietly, "Things change." The camaraderie extended beyond words. Shared glances, quick nods, and silent gestures spoke volumes. When the fireman needed more steam, he could feel the subtle changes in the engineer's touch on the throttle. These silent conversations, carried out through timing and movement, were as vital as any spoken word. The cab was also a place of quiet reflection. They thought of home, of families waiting at journey's end. Yet even in hardship, there was pride. The men knew their work mattered, that they powered the arteries of industry. Their conversations, brief and layered beneath the roar and hiss, were the human voice within the machine. The steam engine was a living thing, but it was also a shared journey, two men bound by fire, metal. The world from the food plate was a moving panorama, a shifting tapestry of fields, towns and stations rushing past the cab's steamed-up windows. Through the haze of smoke and heat, the engineer and fireman saw the landscape not as passengers did, but as guardians and guides of the iron giant that carried them forward. The cab window framed this world in ever-changing slices. Sometimes it was a patchwork of green fields stretching to the horizon, dotted with grazing cattle or waving crops bending in the breeze. The countryside could feel endless and calm, or sudden and alive. The cab's glass was a barrier between the fiery furnace behind and the cool world outside, a lens through which the crew glimpsed life beyond the rails. Other times, it was the bustle of a small town, the clatter of market stalls, children running beside the tracks, the blur of red brick and timber buildings. Each scene passed in a steady stream, like frames of a moving picture, compressed by speed and distance. Between feeding the fire and watching gauges, he caught glimpses of the world beyond rolling hills, farmhouses with smoke curling from chimneys, fences lining endless pastures. Smoke from chimneys rose above rooftops, mingling with the train's own billowing exhaust. Through the window, the crew could see station masters waving, porters bustling, vendors calling out their wares. The engineer's eyes were always watching, scanning the landscape for sign signals, crossings, curves that demanded attention. The air was thick with smells of coal, oil, and human activity. The cab filled briefly with the sounds of whistles, shouts, and clattering footsteps. Rain streaked down glass, or frost etched delicate patterns on cold mornings. The men wiped the windows with grimy cloths, desperate for a clearer view. The engineer's gaze steadied, hands tightening on controls, guiding the engine carefully through nature's challenges. A distant station platform would appear in the corner of the window, passengers waiting in the drizzle or the sun. They were part of a moving world, their vantage point unique, straddling the boundary between the iron furnace and the open landscape. The track stretched out like a silver ribbon, winding through fields and hills, cutting through tunnels and crossing bridges. The engine crew saw the world as a blur of life and movement, forever changing yet eternal a landscape, shaped and connected by the relentless march of the rails. The whistle would sound sharp and clear, announcing their approach. Shadows danced across the cab floor as branches brushed close, the sunlight flickering through leaves. Each bend or hill altered the view and demanded new focus. Towns flickered past in quick succession. The engine might roll through quiet villages with narrow streets and peeling paint, or larger towns with busy docks and warehouses. Fields gave way to forests, dense stands of eucalyptus or pine, creating tunnels of green through which the train thundered. At times, the view was startling: a sudden steep embankment, a rushing river reflecting sky and clouds, or a bridge spanning a deep gorge. The fireman's perspective was different, but equally connected. Both men understood that the landscape was part of the journey, the living backdrop to the endless task of powering the locomotive forward. Stations were moments of pause in this flow. The train would slow, wheels grinding against rails, as passengers and goods were loaded or unloaded. At larger hubs, the scene was more chaotic. Signals flashed, other trains crossed paths, crowds swelled on platforms. Beyond the stations, the world blurred into a steady rhythm of movement. The cab's windows often steamed up from the heat inside, blurring the outside world into impressionistic shapes and colors. Sometimes, the landscape held quiet moments of beauty, a sunrise painting the sky with pink and gold, mist rising from low-lying fields, or a flock of birds scattering from a tree. The world outside was vast and changing, but from the footplate, it felt intimate and immediate, a constant flow of life that the engine both powered through and connected to. The engineer felt this keenly. Every mile passed was measured not just in distance, but in scenery and circumstance. The fireman, though tied to the firebox, shared in these moments, pausing briefly to catch a glimpse of a distant homestead or the faint outline of a mountain range on the horizon. Together, through the cab window, tending the pressure was a relentless task, a constant, watchful dance between fire, water, and steam that demanded the full attention of both fireman and engineer. Within the cab's confined space, amid heat and noise, they stood as guardians of a delicate balance, knowing that every second counted, every adjustment mattered. Here, water became steam, the invisible force that powered pistons and drove the wheels. But that transformation was fraught with risk. Too little water, and the boiler's metal plates could overheat and warp. The dial's needle swung between safe limits, creeping upward as the boiler heated. The engineer's hands hovered over valves and levers, ready to respond at a moment's notice. Too much, and the steam might flood the cylinders, choking the engine's power. Practiced arcs, tossing coal onto the firebed, which crept steadily upward as the boiler heated. He adjusted the regulator valve, the throttle controlling steam flow to the cylinders with small, precise movements. Open it too far too soon, and pressure could drop dangerously. Open it too little, and the train would lose speed. And the injectors sent a steady stream of water into the boiler. When pressure dipped, the fireman fed more coal. The engineer opened the regulator, coaxing power back. The flames leapt and crackled, steam and metal. An overlooked water level, a misjudged fire intensity, a delayed valve adjustment could lead to boiler damage or worse. The men bore that responsibility every moment. The crew's vigilance was the engine's lifeline. Noise and tension, but also skill, rhythm, and teamwork. Together, fireman and engineer kept the pressure in the safe zone, harnessing steam's fury to power the iron giant forward. Set to release steam automatically if pressure got too high, hissed occasionally, the balance shifted constantly. This careful balancing act was the essence of life on the footplate, where power and peril met in a delicate, controlled dance. External conditions, the grade of the track, the weight of the load, the speed required affected steam demand. The crew responded in real time, feeding fire or adjusting water and valves, venting excess steam in sharp bursts. The engineer listened closely for these warnings. A safety valve lifting was a signal to ease back, adjust the fire, or add water, sending heat surging upward into the boiler's water jacket. The men respected the power they controlled. A sudden spike or drop could mean disaster. He adjusted the damper, sliding metal plate controlling airflow, into the firebox, opening it to feed oxygen when the fire needed to burn hotter, closing it slightly when the heat grew too fierce. Too much pressure, and the whole system could rupture with catastrophic consequences. The firemen learned to read the subtle signs, the color of the flames, the roar of the fire, the feel of the heat on his skin. The fire was alive, and he its keeper. The firemen controlled these devices, watching the flow carefully. Too much water at once could cause pressure fluctuations. Too little could risk running dry. The heart of the engine's power lay in the boiler, a vast steel drum filled with water, heated by the roaring fire below, hands steady despite fatigue. Each gauge reading was a piece of a puzzle, revealing the boiler's hidden state. He communicated with the firemen through glances and gestures, a silent partnership forged by necessity. He fed coal to the flames in a measured rhythm, watching how the fire roared and glowed, adjusting the flow to maintain steady heat. The fire needed to burn hot enough to create steam, but not so hot as to endanger the boiler. The fireman wiped sweat from his brow, muscles aching from hours of shoveling and adjusting. He leaned close to the firebox, sensing the flame's behavior, ready to act. The fireman glanced at these tubes constantly, ensuring the level stayed within a narrow band. Too low, and the crown sheet, the boiler's upper plate, could be exposed and overheat. Too high, and water could enter the cylinders, causing a dangerous water hammer. The fireman's eyes were never far from the firebox door and the water gauges. Beside him, the engineer studied the pressure gauge with unblinking focus. The water level was monitored through sight glasses, narrow tubes filled with water that reflected the boiler's internal state. To maintain proper water levels, injectors pushed water from the tender into the boiler using steam pressure. The fireman's shovel moved unsteady. Every handful of coal added was a decision weighed against the pressure gauge's readings. The engineer's role was to manage the pressure and power output. His eyes never left the pressure dial, the safety valves. Steam pressure was the engine's lifeblood, but it was also its greatest hazard. Throughout the journey, in the cab's sweltering heat, the engineer's focus was razor sharp. When the pressure needle hovered near the upper limit, the fireman eased coal feeding. The engineer throttled back slightly. The interplay was constant and endless negotiation between heat and water. The stakes were costly. The cab was a crucible of heat, this endless tending. The fireman's world was one of coal and sweat, an endless cycle of heavy shovels, burning heat, and aching muscles. Each scoop of coal was more than a simple task. It was a test of endurance, strength, and willpower. A daily battle fought in the furnace's glow. The firebox door swung open, releasing a wave of scorching air that hit the fireman's face like a blast furnace. Sweat poured freely, soaking shirt and skin, turning grime into a black paste that clung stubbornly to every surface. Breathing was difficult in the choking, smoky air, lungs burning with each inhale. The heat was immediate and brutal, pressing in from all sides. Thick smoke curled upward, mixing with the sweat pouring from his brow. Yet the fireman moved steadily, driven by duty and pride. It demanded not only physical endurance, but mental toughness, a focus sharp enough to maintain the fire's health while the body screamed for relief. Each load of coal carried the power to drive the locomotive forward, to turn steam into motion, to keep the great engine alive and roaring down the rails. The engineer depended on him for steady steam pressure. The train's crew and passengers relied on the engine's power. There was pride in doing the job well, feeding the fire just right. knowing the engine was running strong because of his labor. The coal lay ready, black lumps piled high, cold and weighty in the tender. He grasped the shovel, its worn wooden handle familiar and rough beneath his calloused hands. Each scoop was heavy, sometimes 40 pounds or more laden with dense, unforgiving coal. He adjusted his stance, stretched aching muscles, wiped grime from his eyes. Every motion was deliberate, careful, practiced. The fireman was a vital part of a living machine, the beating heart of a powerful iron beast. Each shovel of coal was a small victory, a mark of strength and skill. The fireman tuned these sounds out, focusing instead on the feel of coal sliding from shovel to fire, the weight in his arms, the heat at his back. There was no pause, no rest. The fire demanded constant feeding, minute by minute, hour by hour. The fireman's clothes clung heavy with sweat, his breath ragged and shallow. But he never faltered. The fire demanded attention, and the fireman answered with muscle and grit. Muscles tensed and flexed with every heave, the arms pumping, the back bending and straightening in a grueling rhythm. The fireman worked relentlessly, throwing coal into the blazing firebed with practiced precision. It wasn't just brute force, it was technique. Each shovel load had to land in the right spot, spreading evenly across the fire to maintain a steady, controlled burn. Time blurred into a continuous stream of motion and heat. Too much coal dumped in one place could smother the flames. Too little would let the fire falter. The rhythm was relentless. Shovel full, toss, rake coals, adjust the firebed, repeat. Hours passed in this exhausting cycle. Hands blistered and cracked from the rough wood and hot coal dust. Fingers stiffened and blackened. The fireman's skin, once pale, was now coated in soot and sweat, streaked with the evidence of endless labor. The heat sapped strength and will. Muscles ached deeply from shoulders and arms to the lower back and legs that bore the weight and the stance. This was no easy job. Every shovel was an act of determination. The fireman was acutely aware of his role's importance. Even as exhaustion pressed in, the fireman found a rhythm of fierce, grinding pulse that kept him moving. The coal was relentless, but so was he. The cab's heat pressed down like a second skin, unyielding and brutal. The sharp clang of tools and the hiss of steam provided a harsh soundtrack to the endless labor. There was a rough camaraderie in the struggle, shared between fireman and engineer, a bond, forged in sweat and steel, in the endless punishing rhythm of coal and fire. As the day wore on, fatigue mounted. The fireman's movements slowed, but never stopped. Despite the punishment, there was a fierce pride in the work. The firebox was both torment and temple, a place where the fireman wrestled with heat and exhaustion, yet found purpose and mastery. And when the train finally rolled into station, the fireman, soaked and worn, could look back on hours of brutal labor knowing he had fueled the engine's journey, that his sweat and strength had kept the giant moving. In coal and sweat, the fireman's role was carved an unyielding testament to endurance, skill, and pride in a world powered by fire and iron. The smell of steam was a language all its own, an invisible, haunting presence that filled the engine room and clung to every surface, every breath, every thread of clothing. It was the scent of iron and fire, coal and oil, heat and labor, a complex and stubborn aroma that shaped the world of those who worked the mighty steam locomotive. It was a scent that burned the nostrils and settled deep into the lungs, familiar and unyielding. It rose in swirling clouds from the firebox and the smokestack, filling the cab with a relentless, choking presence. The smoke was thick and heavy, a living thing that drifted and curled around every surface. Step into the cab, and the air was thick with this smell, a dense mixture that wrapped around the men like a second skin, impossible to escape. It seeped from the moving joints, the axle boxes, the bearings essential to keeping the engine alive and moving smoothly. Oil stained hands and clothes, adding its own layer to the cab's scent. It coated skin and clothes in a black film, clung to hair and eyelashes, slipped into creases of the skin. It settled into clothes, a layer of grime and memory woven into fabric and leather. The men carried it with them, a mark of their labor and their place in the engine's world. For men who spent hours or days in the cab, it became part of their identity. Years after leaving the footplate, a whiff of coal smoke or engine oil could bring the past rushing back. The heat of the cab, the rhythm of the fire, the clatter of rods, the camaraderie shared in that harsh, fragrant space. To others, the smell might be harsh or unpleasant, but to the men, it was a badge of honor, a sign of endurance and skill. It was a smell of hard work and grit, of soot and flame. It lingered on hands long after washing, embedded deep in hair and beard. The engineer, surrounded by gauges and levers, felt the scent as a tangible link between man and machine, a reminder of the forces he controlled. It marked the men who worked the engine, connecting them across time and place. First came the sharp tang of coal, smoke-black and acrid, bitter and pungent. And smoky days, a testament to a time when iron and fire shaped the world and the men who mastered them. It was a world that left its mark long after the journey ended, etched into memory as clearly as the sound of the whistle or the feel of the throttle. Coal dust hung in the air like a fine powder, gritty and abrasive. It was as much a presence as the roar of pistons or the hiss of valves. The firebox, the beating heart of the engine, radiated not only heat, but a smell of charred fuel and embers. It drifted back to the engineer's seat, mixing with the cleaner scent of the outdoors, slipping through cracked windows or open vents. But it was also comforting in its familiarity, a sign of the engine's life and power. It was a smell that spoke of transformation, raw coal turning to flame, water turning to steam, the faint but persistent scent of oil-slicked metal, the warm smoky haze hanging in shafts of light through the windows. Mixed with the coal smoke was the oily, metallic scent of machinery. The smell of hot metal, bronze and steel, warmed to glowing temperatures, tinged the air with a sharp, almost electric bite. This was the smell of moving parts, pistons and rods sliding and clanking in perfect mechanical rhythm. The pungent aroma of lubricating oil was constant, sharp and almost sweet in contrast to the bitter smoke. There was also the smell of hot iron, the metallic tang of metal expanding under intense heat. It was a smell both harsh and alive, telling of forces at work beneath the cab floor, heat and pressure, fire and steam, the physical power harnessed and controlled. The air was dry and scorched, carrying a faint hint of burnt wood and ash. The mixture was overwhelming and inescapable. Even after stepping from the cab into fresh air, the smell clung stubbornly. Skin retained the scent true sweat mingled with coal dust and oil, forming a unique, unshakable perfume. The smell was a language of the past as well as the present. At times, the smell evoked memory and reflection. The smell was tied to the engine's breath and heartbeat, to the endless task of tending fire and steam. Even the quiet moments in the cab were filled with it, the deep, earthy aroma of coal resting on the grate. The smell shaped the rhythm of the day. It was thickest near the firebox door, where flames licked coal and metal. Sometimes, the smell was oppressive, a constant reminder of the harshness and danger of the job. The fireman would often inhale deeply, the smoke stinging lungs but grounding him in his work. The smell of steam was not just a fragrance, it was a symbol. It spoke of industry, endurance, and the raw elemental power of fire and metal. To step into the cab was to enter a world defined by smell, a world of coal and sweat, oil and fire, heat and metal. And so, the smell of steam endured an invisible but ever-present companion on the long roads. Troubles on the tracks were never far from the minds of those who worked the steam engine. Beneath the roaring power and steady rhythm lay a fragile balance, a delicate tension between force and control, heat and metal, steam and pressure. When things went wrong, the consequences could be swift and severe, demanding the crew's immediate skill and calm. One of the most feared problems was low water in the boiler. The fireman's face tightened with concentration and concern as he fought to maintain that vital balance. Bearings could seize, axles could heat dangerously, and metal could warp under stress. The engineer listened carefully for unusual sounds: a grinding, a shriek, a change in the rhythmic chugging that might signal trouble. The massive steel drum that held thousands of liters of water was the heart of the engine as power, but also its greatest vulnerability. Sometimes sand would be dropped on the rails to increase grip, a gritty, dusty blast that rose in clouds around the wheels. The needle on the pressure gauge could leap unexpectedly, sometimes caused by a surge in the fire's intensity, a blocked steam line, or a malfunctioning valve. Without enough water, the boiler's metal plates could overheat, warp, or even rupture, a catastrophic failure that could endanger lives. The engineer and fireman worked swiftly to reduce the fire, add water, or adjust controls, their movements quick and practiced. The engineer would order an emergency stop if necessary, knowing that pushing on could cause severe damage or derailment. The men lived with this danger every day, aware that a single mistake could turn power into destruction. The firemen watched the water gauges constantly, a narrow glass tube called a sight glass revealing the water level inside. Sometimes the engineer had to fiddle with valves and levers, trying to isolate the fault or manage pressure. It might mean a mechanical failure, a broken piston, or a loss of steam pressure. The engineer and fireman moved swiftly, communicating with gestures and quick words, diagnosing problems and attempting repairs on the fly. There were moments when the powerful machine felt fragile, when the men's partnership and vigilance made the difference between disaster and survival. When the engine struggled to grip the tracks, the wheels would spin faster than the train moved, throwing sparks and dust into the air. Panic could spell disaster, while steady hands and clear minds could save the day. The crew faced long hours waiting for help, stranded on the tracks amid the harsh elements. This wasted precious steam pressure and threatened to wear down tires and rails. When that level dropped too low, alarm bells rang in his mind. His hands moved swiftly, opening injectors to pump water from the tender into the boiler, watching for signs that the water had returned to a safe level. But it wasn't always simple. Sometimes the injectors clogged or failed. Sometimes the water supply was low, or the pumps struggled on steep grades. The engineer trusted his instruments, but also his ears and instincts, sensing trouble before it became obvious. Overheating parts were another constant threat. The massive iron wheels and rods moved with enormous force and friction. When a bearing heated too much, it might give off a faint burning smell or even smoke. Slipping wheels were a common but tricky problem, especially on wet or greasy rails. The engineer had to adjust the throttle carefully, easing back steam to regain traction without losing too much speed. Sudden spikes in steam pressure were perhaps the most alarming events. When the pressure rose too high, safety valves hissed open, venting steam in a sharp, explosive rush. But if the pressure rose uncontrollably, the risk of boiler explosion became a catastrophic and deadly event. Silence in the cab was another ominous sign. When the rhythmic chug of the engine faltered or stopped altogether, the crew's heart sank. In those moments, the cab filled with tense urgency. Sometimes the fireman had to open the firebox door to stoke the flames harder, coaxing steam back into the system. Other times, the problem was beyond immediate repair, and the train had to be brought to a halt. Throughout these troubles, calm and experience were the crew's greatest assets. The firemen learned to read the subtle signs, the flicker of a flame, the tone of a whistle, the feel of heat on metal. Troubles on the tracks tested every skill and every nerve. And when the problems passed and steam pressure stabilized once more, there was a quiet relief, a shared understanding of the dangers faced and overcome in the fiery belly of the iron beast. The day was drawing to a close, the long journey of fire and steel coming to an end. After hours of relentless heat, roaring pistons, and surging steam, the giant was finally ready to rest. The fireman stood at the firebox door, his hands steady despite exhaustion, his eyes fixed on the glowing bed of embers that remained after the flames had spent themselves. Shutting down the engine was no mere flick of a switch. It was a careful, patient ritual, a slow unwinding of power and life in the iron beast. As the oxygen supply dwindled, the flames shrank back, retreating from their once wild dance into a low, steady crackle. The sharp, constant hiss of steam venting from safety valves softened, becoming intermittent puffs of sighing breaths releasing the engine's pent-up power. The roar of the fire became a gentle hiss, then a whisper, until silence settled over the firebox like a cooling blanket. Each handful was smaller, less fierce, a final offering to keep the fire smoldering but not roaring. The fireman leaned his shovel against the wall, its handle worn and smooth from years of use and heat. The metal walls that had radiated fierce heat were cooling slowly, releasing their stored warmth into the cooling evening air. The windows, fogged and streaked from hours of sweat and smoke, now reflected the soft fading light, framing the world outside in muted colors. The oil can was capped and stored with care on its shelf, a reminder of the constant need to lubricate the moving parts and keep the giant alive. The day's toil had spoken more than conversation ever could. Their movements were slow, deliberate, marked by a shared understanding forged in heat and steam. He ran a hand along the cool brass of a lever, feeling the smooth metal beneath his fingertips, a tactile reminder of control and connection. The cab, once a furnace of noise and fury, was now a quiet sanctuary cooling into stillness. Blues turned to purples, soft grays blended with amber as the sun's last rays stretched low over the rails. Other engines lay silent, their crews performing similar closing rituals. The smell of coal smoke and oil lingered stubbornly on their clothes and skin, a testament to the day's labor, an invisible mark worn with quiet pride. The massive wheels rested still, the rods and pistons cool and silent. The engineer stretched tired limbs, eyes reflecting the deep satisfaction of a day's hard work well done. A recognition of power contained and released, of danger mastered, of a living machine nurtured by hands worn and steady. The giant was resting now, its fury spent for the day. It was a lullaby for the iron giant, a promise of awakening with the dawn. Footsteps on gravel echoed softly as workers moved between carriages, voices low and distant. The iron skin shimmered with the residue of heat and labor, blackened and streaked with soot, but gleaming faintly in the dusk. Smoke curled slowly and lazily from the smokestack. Thinner now, cooler, a final breath of fire spent and power fading. The iron beast lay in patient sleep, gathering strength for the journey to come. The injectors that fed water into the boiler were shut off with precise taps, ensuring no excess water remained flowing. The fireman wiped sweat and soot from his face, muscles heavy with fatigue but proud. The long shadows of the yard lengthened, wrapping the stationary locomotives in a gentle embrace. The engineer's wrench was wiped clean and laid down, ready for the next shift's demands. The rhythm of shoveling slowed, replaced by the soft scrape of tools raking the firebed evenly, coaxing the heat to fade gently. The throttle was gradually closed, cutting off the steam that powered the pistons and drove the wheels. The rhythmic chugging that had defined the journey began to slow, fading first to a gentle rumble, then to a stillness that filled the cab with calm. Inside the cab, the air began to lose its intense heat, the blistering furnace glow fading to a gentle warmth that lingered like the last embers of a dying fire. He moved deliberately now, laying down shovels of coal with care rather than urgency. The damper the metal flap controlling the airflow to the firebox was eased closed slowly. Steam pressure within the massive boiler began to ease. The needle on the pressure gauge crept steadily downward from its daytime peak, moving through the safe zone toward the resting point. The engineer's hands moved across the controls with practiced care. Safety valves released their last hisses, venting final excess steam in gentle bursts. The whistle, so often a loud, commanding voice piercing the countryside, was silent now. Its echo, carried on the wind, dissolved into the growing twilight. Tools that had been the fireman and engineer as constant companions throughout the day were set aside carefully. The cab itself settled into quiet. Outside the cab, the sky was a canvas of deepening shades. The engine, now still and quiet, seemed almost alive in its rest, a sleeping giant breathing its last sighs. The fireman and engineer exchanged few words in these closing moments. The fireman made final checks on the firebox door, sealing it carefully to hold in the last embers. The engineer scanned the gauges one last time, verifying that pressure had stabilized safely, that water levels were steady, and all valves rested in neutral. Together, they closed up the cab. Windows and vents were secured, tools stowed, and the fireman's shovel rested against the side wall like a sentinel. Outside, the railway yard was settling into the calm of evening. The fireman and engineer stepped from the cab, drawing deep breaths of the cooling air. The men paused briefly by the engine's side, watching as the final tendrils of steam drifted skyward, disappearing into the darkening air. The fireman pulled his cap lower, muscles relaxing for the first time in hours. Around them, the yard grew darker, lights twinkling like stars along the rails. Shutting down the giant was more than an end. It was a moment of quiet reverence. The engine's final breaths mingled with the cool evening air, a soft, fading hiss that spoke of fire tamed and steam spent. And as the night deepened, the locomotive rested silent, still, and waiting, ready to rise again with the first light, to roar once more through the waking world.